August 1916, Verdun, France. Unteroffizier Klaus Hoffmann stared through his range finder at Fort Douaumont, 3 kilometers distant across the cratered wasteland that had once been French farmland. The fortress squatted on its ridge like a malignant tumor, concrete and steel, 30 meters of earth covering its magazines, walls 4 meters thick, gun turrets that could rotate and fire in any direction. For 6 months, German artillery had pounded it. For 6 months, it had endured. Hoffmann was 28, an artillery NCO who had studied engineering at Munich before the war. He understood trajectories, explosive force, and structural mechanics. He also understood futility. The German army had fired over 2 million shells at Verdun. Fort Douaumont had absorbed most of them without significant damage. Its designers had built it to withstand exactly this kind of bombardment. "Same result as yesterday," said Lieutenant Werner Krause, Hoffmann's battery commander. "Direct hits on the superstructure, no penetration. The French are still in there and we're still wasting ammunition." The battery's 21 cm Mercer howitzers could lob 113 kilogram shells in high arcs, dropping them onto targets with devastating force. But Fort Douaumont's design defeated that force. The roof was sloped. Shells hit at angles and glanced off or detonated on the surface, their energy dissipating against reinforced concrete rather than penetrating into the vulnerable interior. The problem wasn't power, the problem was geometry. Hoffmann had been calculating angles for 3 weeks, trying to find a trajectory that would allow shells to strike vertically enough to penetrate. But physics was unforgiving. The howitzers could fire at angles up to 70 degrees, but at that angle, range decreased dramatically. To maintain the 3-kilometer distance needed to stay outside French counter-battery range, they had to fire at 45 degrees or less. At those angles, shells struck the fort's roof at insufficient vertical velocity to penetrate before detonating. It was an engineering problem masquerading as a military problem. The fort was perfectly designed to defeat their shells. The shells were perfectly designed to destroy anything except this fort. That night, Hoffmann sat in the artillery dugout, reviewing ballistic tables by lamplight. Around him, other NCOs played cards, wrote letters, or slept. Outside, the bombardment continued. Other batteries, other targets, the steady background thunder that had defined existence at Verdun for half a year. Hoffmann sketched the problem on a piece of paper. Shell trajectory, parabolic arc. Impact angle, 35-40 degrees from vertical. Fuse, impact detonation, triggered when the shell struck the target. Detonation occurred on the surface, creating a crater but failing to breach the concrete. What if the fuse didn't detonate on impact? The thought arrived fully formed, almost absurd in its simplicity. German artillery fuses were designed to explode instantly upon contact, maximizing surface damage. But against Fort Douaumont, surface damage was irrelevant. What they needed was penetration, shells that would punch through the concrete before exploding, delivering their force inside the structure where it could do real damage. The fuses weren't designed for that, but could they be modified? Hoffmann pulled out a disassembled fuse from his equipment locker, a standard DOP, Z92 impact fuse, precision manufactured in Essen, designed to be utterly reliable. Its firing pin was held back by a setback spring. On impact, inertia drove the pin forward into the detonator, initiating the explosion. The entire mechanism worked in microseconds. What if he added delay? Not much. Just enough for the shell to penetrate a meter or 2 of concrete before detonating. 1/10 of a second, maybe less. Enough for kinetic energy to breach the surface before explosive energy destroyed the interior. The modification would be crude. He'd need to add a resistance mechanism to the firing pin, something that would slow its forward travel by a fraction of a second. A small spring, perhaps, or a friction disc. Something simple, improvised, and completely unauthorized. Something stupid. The unauthorized experiment. Hoffman spent the next 2 days fabricating a prototype. He disassembled 3 fuses, extracted their firing mechanisms, and experimented with modifications. Too much delay and the shell would penetrate completely through the fort before exploding, wasting its force. Too little and it would still detonate on the surface. The sweet spot was approximately 0.15 seconds, enough time for a 113 kg shell traveling at 240 meters per second to penetrate 1.5 meters into concrete before detonation. At that depth, the explosive force would be contained within the structure, multiplying its destructive effect. He fashioned a delay mechanism from a small copper disc that would compress on impact, creating friction that slowed the firing pin's travel. It was inelegant, unreliable, and violated every principle of precision engineering that German fuse manufacturers followed. It was also the only solution he could manufacture with available materials. On August 17, Hoffman showed his work to Lieutenant Krause. The officer examined the modified fuse skeptically. "This is field modification of ordnance," Krause said. "Unauthorized modification. If it fails, you'll be court-martialed. If it works but injures our own crew through premature detonation, you'll be shot." "I understand, sir. And you still want to test it?" "We've been bombarding that fort for 6 months with 0 results. This modification might allow penetration before detonation. It might actually damage the fort." Krause was quiet for a long moment. "One test shot. If it fails catastrophically, we never speak of this again. If it works, we document results and submit through proper channels." "Thank you, sir." The test occurred at 600 hours on August 18. Hoffman personally supervised loading of a single shell fitted with his modified fuse. The gun crew knew something irregular was happening, but asked no questions. Soldiers who survived Verdun learned not to question decisions that might improve their odds. The Mercer fired. The shell arced through dawn light, describing its parabolic trajectory toward Fort Douaumont. Hoffman tracked it through field glasses, watching it descend, strike the fort's roof, and penetrate before exploding. The detonation was different. Instead of a surface blast that scattered debris outward, this explosion was muffled, contained, forcing its energy downward into the structure. A section of the fort's roof, approximately 4 meters square, collapsed inward. "God in heaven," Krause whispered. "It worked." "It worked," Hoffman confirmed. For the first time in 6 months, they had inflicted structural damage on Fort Douaumont. The rapid adoption. Word spread through the artillery corps with remarkable speed. By August 20, Hoffman was demonstrating his modification to officers from 3 different batteries. By August 22, he was training other NCOs to fabricate the delayed fuses. By August 25, modified shells were being fired at Fort Douaumont from 5 batteries simultaneously. The results were devastating. Shells that had previously bounced off or detonated harmlessly on the surface now punched through concrete and exploded internally. The fort's roof began collapsing in sections. Interior chambers were breached. French defenders who had felt invulnerable behind meters of concrete now faced artillery shells detonating inside their corridors. The German artillery corps had discovered that the solution to an impregnable fortress wasn't more power. It was correctly applied power at the right moment. Hoffman's crude copper disc had transformed every shell from a surface weapon into a penetration weapon. By September 3, Fort Douaumont's structural integrity had degraded to the point where French command ordered partial evacuation. By September 8, German infantry could approach within 500 meters without being annihilated by the fort's guns, which were now disabled or buried under collapsed concrete. On September 12, German forces assaulted Fort Douaumont. They encountered resistance, but nothing like the impregnable defense that had repelled previous attacks. The fort fell in 18 hours. The siege was broken. Hoffman's modification had ended a 6-month stalemate in 3 weeks. The institutional response. On September 20, Hoffman received orders to report to artillery headquarters at Stenne, 40 kilometers behind the lines. He assumed he was being court-martialed for unauthorized modification of ordnance. Instead, he found himself in a conference room with a colonel, 2 majors, and 3 civilian engineers from Krupp Munitions Works. "Unteroffizier Hoffman," the colonel began, "your field modification of artillery fuses achieved results that 6 months of conventional bombardment could not. You broke a siege. You enabled the capture of France's strongest fortress, and you did it with copper discs and improvisation." "Sir, I'm not finished. You also violated regulations regarding ordnance modification. You introduced unauthorized changes to precision-manufactured fuses. You could have caused premature detonations that would have killed your own gun crews." Hoffman said nothing. "However," the colonel continued, "your modification works. Krupp's engineers have analyzed it. They've determined it's mechanically sound, reproducible, and effective. They want to manufacture it." One of the Krupp engineers spoke up. "Your delay mechanism is crude but functional. We can refine it, standardize production, and integrate it into our existing fuse designs. We estimate production of 50,000 modified fuses per month, available for issue to all artillery units." "Will I be credited?" Hoffman asked. The colonel and engineers exchanged glances. "Your contribution will be noted in technical documentation," the colonel said carefully. "But the modified fuse will be designated Krupp Model 1617, manufactured under standard production protocols. Individual attribution is complicated in military contexts." Hoffman understood. The modification would be absorbed into institutional production. The innovation would be credited to Krupp. His name would appear in footnotes if anywhere. "However," the colonel added, "you are being promoted to Feldwebel and assigned to artillery technical services. You'll advise on field modifications and improvise solutions. Your expertise is valuable." It was a strange reward. Recognition through assignment rather than commendation. Authority without credit. But it was more than Hoffman had expected. The legacy. The modified fuse, officially designated the DOP Z1617, was mass-produced and issued throughout 1917. It transformed German artillery effectiveness against fortified positions. What had taken months of bombardment could now be achieved in weeks or days. Other nations noticed. By 1918, France, Britain, and the United States had developed their own delayed-action fuses based on similar principles. The concept became standard: artillery shells designed to penetrate before detonating, maximizing damage against hardened structures. Hoffman survived the war. He returned to Munich in 1919, completed his engineering degree, and worked for Krupp until 1935 when he retired. He never spoke publicly about the fuse modification. When asked about his war service, he mentioned artillery work in general terms and changed the subject. In 1964, a military historian researching the fall of Fort Douaumont discovered references to Hoffman's delay modification in archived technical reports. He contacted Hoffman, now 76 and living quietly in Bavaria. "Did you invent the delayed-action artillery fuse?" the historian asked. "I modified an existing fuse using available materials," Hoffman replied. "Others refined it into something manufacturable. I contributed, but the innovation was collective." "But you had the original idea." "I had a problem and improvised a solution. That's what soldiers do." The historian published a paper in 1966 documenting Hoffman's contribution. It was read by approximately 400 military historians and ordnance specialists. It did not change textbooks or popular understanding of WWI artillery development. Hoffman died in 1973. His obituary mentioned his engineering career and wartime service, but made no reference to the fuse modification that had broken the siege of Verdun. The DOP Z1617 fuse and its derivatives continued in use through World War II and beyond. Modern delayed-action munitions use electronic timing rather than mechanical friction, but the principle remains identical: penetration before detonation, applying force where it's most effective rather than where it's most visible. Klaus Hoffmann's copper disc changed how artillery functioned. The innovation was absorbed so completely into standard practice that its origin was forgotten within a generation. He received a promotion, a technical services assignment, and historical footnotes. The siege was broken, the fort fell, the stupid fix worked. And the man who made it possible disappeared into the institutional machinery that credited innovations to manufacturers rather than to the soldiers who improvised them under fire. Sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the work matters more than recognition. Sometimes breaking an impossible siege with a copper disc and understanding of physics is its own reward, even if no one remembers your name. Fort Douaumont stands today as a memorial and museum. Visitors can see the collapsed sections of roof, the breached chambers, the structural damage that ended its role as an impregnable fortress. They can read about German artillery, Krupp munitions, and the siege of Verdun. What they won't read is the name Klaus Hoffmann, or learn that one NCO with an engineering background solved in 3 weeks what 6 months of conventional bombardment could not. The fortress fell, the fuse worked, the innovator was forgotten. That's the mathematics of military innovation. Results endure, credit fades, and the stupid fixes that change wars become standard procedure so quickly that no one remembers they once seemed impossible.